Hey everybody, my name is Patrick and I'm an iOS and web developer. Today I wanted to walk through a straightforward example on how to make a server call to an API using Swift and SwiftUI. One thing I notice whenever I Google this is that there's always a ton of different ways to do this, and some of them are like out of date or use third-party dependencies such as Almafire, which for this use case isn't really necessary. So I wanted to show how to use the async await pattern, especially for those who are kind of coming from a web development background like myself and understand how async and await work with JavaScript promises. This is pretty similar and kind of reminds me of how fetch requests work, if you're familiar with that. If not, that's okay. Stick with me and we'll get through it together. So let's dive in. So the first thing that I want to show, and let me share my screen here, is that we have kind of a sample app here that's a Pokemon API powered app. And so what I'm going to kind of show you using this Pokédex app UI is how to call the unofficial Pokemon API using Swift and SwiftUI. And so a basic way of how this app will work is that if you put in like a Pokemon's name, let's put in Bulbasaur, for example, then you'll be able to see its name, and hopefully you'll be able to see an image that pops up from this unofficial Pokemon API and it's the abilities it has, and that's pretty much it. I wanted to keep it simple. We'll probably only get to like the name portion in this video just to give you a basic example or basic idea of how this API call works. And maybe in like a second follow-up video, I can create this whole thing and really flesh it out. But for now, let me jump over to the code real quick. And let me go to the content view here. And this is like the UI portion that you're seeing. Obviously, there's a few red angry issues here that we're going to have to address, and that's totally fine. This is actually copied and pasted from another project of mine that I've already completed that you kind of saw in this demo here. So what I really want to do is focus on the Pokédex API portion here, if you see this, and we're going to flesh this out and go ahead and make it. So let's go and do that. So the first thing that I want to mention is that you'll have to create a new file for this, and you're going to call it Pokédex API. You can call it whatever you want. It doesn't really matter, right? But basically, this is where we're going to be calling the Pokédex API and getting the proper Pokemon back. And so before I go into this function call that I plan on creating, I want to kind of go over the JSON example I have of the Pokemon API. And so it has a ton of different functionality. I highly recommend that you check it out. But at a base level, this is kind of what the JSON looks like. Like you have the abilities, the base experience, the name, the ID of the Pokemon, and all this other cool stuff. Like you got the sprites from all these different games. Really, this unofficial Pokédex API or Pokemon API has thought of it all, right? So they have tons of stuff here. We're really only concerned with the name and any other base level ones at this moment. Like I said, maybe in a follow-up video, I'll do another one. But anyway, what we want to do is really flesh out this Pokédex API class. And so this is just going to be a pretty simple class. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to pass this Pokemon name right here as a string. And we're going to call the Pokédex API with this endpoint. Let me go grab that really quickly. So we have this, let's call this the base URL, right? And so it's just this, PokeAPI.co, API v2, and Pokemon. And then at the end here, we're going to want to put the Pokemon name, right? And so, we're going to do Pokemon name, right? So, so this is the base URL here that we're kind of looking for. And we'll get to all the details of if this is invalid or something like that, or if it throws like a 404 or whatever. And so the next thing we want to do is kind of create what's called a URL component. And this URL component, I kind of copied and pasted in there just for to be quick about it. But basically, this URL component is an object that's native to Swift. Well, I think this is apples, but it's related to just like constructing URLs. And for our purposes, we really just need this base URL to come back as a URL component itself. And that'll get us started with the async await stuff. And so before I go any further, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and create a, we'll call it a service URL. And basically what this means is that we're just getting the URL object from this URL component. Otherwise, we're gonna let's say return nil, right? Oops. And so what we're doing here is that we're gonna add a guard just in case this URL doesn't come back or is invalid or something. We're gonna say, hey, we're gonna return, nothing here, and just end this function call immediately, right? So as you can see, we have return nil, but we don't have a return type, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But so we'll just let that angry red guy be there for a minute, the angry red error, and kind of move on. So what we want to do, that play on words was somewhat intended, is create a do catch here. And so yeah, this do catch closure, what we want to do in here is we want to get the data from the Pokemon API, and this is where we do it. And so we're going to say let data equals try await URL session shared data. And so this is kind of the more recent way that Swift has decided you should make API calls, is with this URL session shared data. I think before it was like data task, or there were a few other different ones, but this is a more recent development, I believe. And so we want to just put the service URL in there. And so so if you see here, if I could do this properly, with URL session, yep. And as you can kind of see here, it's going to get mad at me and say, hey, this async call doesn't support concurrency or whatever. And so that just means that here we need to put async to let Swift know it's an asynchronous function, and we put throws, throws here, so it'll throw an error if something goes wrong. And so so let's keep that there, and then let's say that there is an error, we're just going to print Pokédex error. We'll say Pokédex API error, and then we will print out the localized description of the error, which is kind of a standard thing when you're doing these kind of things in Swift. And so so we're going to get the data. And so after we get the data, we're going to say, hey, we want to turn this into Pokemon data and in a way that we can read it. And so before I go ahead and do this, I'll take one step back and mention how this URL session shared data thing kind of works, right? So what we're seeing is that this will make a service call and get the result in just this big blob of like raw data, like it's like binary data or something like that. It actually comes back as the data type in Swift. And so we have to convert that data somehow to a readable response that we can use and use successfully in like the SwiftUI View once we move it over there. And so that means that we need some sort of way to decode that blob into JSON, right? Or into like a JSON type format. And so the best way to go ahead and do that is we want to, we'll call this struct, and we're going to call this JSON response. And we want to set it to codable. And codable basically means that this plays nice with the coding and like codable and decodable APIs that Swift has, which basically means that there is a JSON decodable function that will allow you to completely decode this, make this human readable, and make it into chunks that Swift will understand, right? And so the way we do that is creating the struct, and then let's say we want to get the name of the Pokemon, so var name string, we want to declare that. We also want to get the ID, right? ID, and we'll say that's an integer. And we're going to put these as optionals because, if for some reason it doesn't come back properly or something bad happens, we want to be able to gracefully escape that. And so for this demo, I'm just going to put the name. I'm not going to put anything else, but in a future video, I'll put like the abilities and the sprites and all that fun stuff from the demo I showed you. So we have the JSON response. And so what we want to do is we want to go ahead and say, hey, we need some way to decode this raw data here, right? And so how do we do that with this JSON response that we just declared, this structure? So let's go ahead and create another function, and we're going to call this decode to JSON, right? And so we want the raw data going to come back in data form, like I mentioned before. And so when we decode to JSON, we're going to say, we're going to let decoder equals JSON decoder. So we're going to create a new instance of this JSON decoder. And we're going to use the do catch pattern one more time. And the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to declare this decoded response here. And we're going to try to decode it, right? Decoder.decode. And this decoder.decode requires you to actually put in a type for what you want to decode this blob into, right? And so in our case, we created this struct up here, this JSON response struct. And so we want to just say JSON response.self, right? And that basically is referencing the type that we just created for this JSON response. And so we want to say from the raw data that we're passing in, which is that big blob that I mentioned a few times earlier. And so once we do that, we're going to want to return this, this decoded response, right? If there's some sort of error for some reason, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste what I had before. And we're going to say, we're just going to return nothing. And so that leaves the return type kind of a mystery, right? So let's resolve that. So Swift knows what we're doing. We're going to say JSON response, and that will make that an optional because we can return nil here. And so, so go ahead and give that a build. And it's still going to fail because we're not quite done up here. What we want to do is we want to say, okay, we want to decode that. Whoops, not here, right here. My bad. What we want to do here is we want to set the Poke data to self.decode raw response, and we want to pass that raw blob data into there so we decode it properly, right? So the cool thing now is that we're going to have this JSON response here coming back properly, and then we're going to go ahead and return what we're supposed to. And so one thing that I forgot to do here, we're getting this error that says cannot convert data, URL response to expected argument type data, is that we want to actually put this in parentheses because it's giving us back two things. It's giving us back a tuple instead of just a regular value. And we only want the raw data. This is like another URL response object that we don't really need to worry about at this point. So we do that. And so we get, once we decode to JSON, we get this JSON response with the name and the integer here, right? And so what we want to do is we want to go ahead and say, hey, we're going to return Poke data. And we don't really necessarily need to create this extra variable here in memory, but for our cases, it's not a big deal. Makes it a little more human readable. And so as you can see here, it's kind of yelling at us because there's it's an unexpected non-void return value in void function, right? So what does this mean? So if you go up here, it means that we don't have a return type at all, and we're returning things. So what we want to do is we want to say, hey, we're going to return this as a JSON response, right? And so if we rebuild, and anyway, so now that this all is kind of working, we want to see if we can actually run this and see what we get back, right? So we're going to put a debugger here. We're going to click play. It's going to load our little UI app that I already kind of copied and pasted in here. And it says, please enter Pokemon. It says it twice, but that's okay. And we'll say Bulbasaur, right? And so we'll hit return. And it's going to step in from the content view here. As you can see, where whenever the editing is changed or is unfocused, like when we click return, for example, it's going to take this else path. And there's this task here. And this task is kind of like a promise in JavaScript. And so basically it's going to run everything in here in this do catch. And when it's done, after this await, it's going to say, hey, I'm all done. We're going to make these state changes after the await call is done. And we're going to go from there, right? And so at this point, we're at the make API call step where we're putting in the input text. We're going to lowercase it just in case anybody puts uppercase, anything like that, because the Pokemon API requires this to be lowercase. And so if we go over to the Pokédex API file, we see that this data is just a bunch of raw data. It's like a data representation, it's called. And so this is very raw and we can't really do anything with it now. But as we can see, when we decode it to JSON and we pass the data in, it returns with an object that has is in the style of the JSON response structure that we made above right here. And then we can see the name is coming back, Bulbasaur, and the ID is coming back as the first Pokemon on the list. And so that's exactly what we want to come back here, right? And so let's keep going through. So let's click continue. So as you can see, Bulbasaur is coming up right here, which is great. That's exactly what we wanted. If we go to the content view, we can kind of see, like, let's scroll down. If the Pokemon is not equal to nil, the current Pokemon, so that means if we have a Pokemon that we looked up, we're gonna say, hey, let's declare the Pokemon name to this variable, and we're gonna spit it out with this text, and we're done, right? And so one other thing that we can do here, you'll notice if I go back to the Pokédex API, is that this JSON response also has an ID that's coming back, right? And so we want to do that for every Pokemon available. And so you can see here, we have the current Pokemon name instead of like this, this text view. And it's a large font and it falls back to unknown Pokemon if you don't know the Pokemon's name or anything like that. But let's take it one step further and we're going to go ahead and say, let current Pokemon ID with current Pokemon ID, right? And so since this is an integer, we want to make sure that we change this to a string. And we also want to make sure that it has a fallback, and we're just going to put this as 1, the integer 1. And so then we want to display this. We just say current Pokemon ID, wrap it in a text view, and we should be good to go. Build succeeded. Let's see what happens. So we're going to enter, let's enter a random one. Let's say Kadabra. And it's going to hit our breakpoint here. We'll go ahead and unset now. And you can see Kadabra is number 64, Pokemon number 64. And let's do like another fun one, right? Let's do Pikachu, for example. Pikachu is number 25, and we're getting that from the Pokemon API, which doesn't require any sort of authentication or anything, which is great for demo presentations and stuff like that. So I'd highly recommend that. And then let's go back to our old friend Bulbasaur, if I can spell it right. And it gets the ID back of 1, and it gets the name of Bulbasaur. And so that is how you make a simple kind of async await request using SwiftUI in Swift. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I will put the code right in the comments section, just as like a GitHub gist or a GitHub repo. And yeah, if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. Thank you so much for watching.